It all started when I was 19 and just starting my sophomore year at the University of Memphis. I lived in a small apartment on campus with my friend Clarence. Nothing special, just 2 bedrooms, a shared bathroom and a tiny living room where we used to watch movies or argue about music. Clarence and I got along pretty well, although he could drive me crazy with his habit of leaving dirty dishes in the sink. Life was calm until one day in September, when our 3rd roommate moved in. Hello, dear friends. In this story, I will tell you how my life in Memphis turned upside down when I met a guy who made my heart beat like never before. Make yourself comfortable, grab a cup of tea or coffee and stay with me until the end. It will be spicy, I promise. His name was Edward, and let me tell you, he didn't look like your average freshman. When he walked in, I nearly dropped my phone. Tall, with dark wavy hair that fell slightly over his forehead, and eyes that seemed to see right through you. His smile was so warm I couldn't help but grin back. He stuck out his hand and said, "Hey, I'm Edward, nice to meet you." His voice was deep, with a slight southern drawl that made every word sound a little softer. I'd been out as gay for a few years, so I didn't pretend I didn't notice how good-looking he was. But I'm not the type to dive in headfirst. My brain immediately started plotting how to play this. I decided I'd be sneaky, get to know him, become friends, and then, if I got lucky, see if he was into me. "Welcome, Edward," I said, trying to sound casual, even though my insides were buzzing with curiosity. That evening, the 3 of us hung out in the living room, helping Edward unpack. He told us he was from Nashville, loved rock music, and sometimes played guitar. I noticed how he laughed, easy, contagious, and realized I needed to be careful. This guy could be trouble if I didn't keep my cool. Clarence was cracking jokes about his party plans, while I kept stealing glances at Edward, trying to gauge how he reacted to my comments. When Clarence went to bed, Edward and I stayed up. I suggested watching a movie to break the ice. "You pick," he said, sprawling out on the couch. I chose an old comedy, but honestly, I barely paid attention to the screen. My mind was racing, thinking about how to get closer without being obvious. I scooted a bit nearer, pretending I needed a better view of the TV, and noticed he didn't move away. It was a small sign, but it meant a lot to me. By the end of the night, I knew one thing for sure. Edward was someone I'd keep my eye on. I wasn't gonna rush, but I was already cooking up a plan to make him a bigger part of my life. After that first night with Edward, I knew I had to play my cards carefully but boldly. He wasn't the type to open up right away, and being the sneaky guy I am, I decided to use that to my advantage. My goal was clear: become someone he couldn't resist spending time with, so he'd want to be around me more. I started small, inviting him to hang out with me and Clarence, but always finding ways to get us alone. A couple of days after he moved in, we were chilling in the living room, flipping through TV channels. Clarence had gone to a lecture, and I could feel the air between us getting a little heavier. Edward was sprawled on the couch, looking relaxed, but I caught him sneaking quick glances at me. "Wanna order some pizza?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. He nodded, and I deliberately picked a topping he'd mentioned he liked: anchovies. "You remembered what I'm into?" he said with a small smile, and my heart did a little flip. While we ate, I started asking about his life in Nashville. He told me about his older sister who taught him how to cook and how he once crashed his dad's car trying to impress his friends. I laughed, but in my head I was figuring out how to use these stories to get closer. "So, are you always this good, or do you ever play the bad boy?" I asked with a sly grin, tossing in a bit of flirtation. He laughed and said, "Depends on the company, Ronald." "What, you trying to figure me out?" His tone was playful, and I knew he didn't mind the vibe. I decided to push a little further. "You know, there's this spot in Memphis where all the cool folks hang out," I said. "Maybe we should check it out this weekend?" He agreed, and I mentally high-fived myself for the win. The night went on, and we talked about music, sports, even movies that annoyed us as kids. I made sure to vibe with his interests, nodding when he mentioned rock bands, even though I'm more into pop. That was my game. Make him feel like we were totally in sync. After we finished the pizza, I suggested playing cards to keep the night going. We sat on the floor, and I let him win a few rounds to boost his confidence. At one point, he leaned closer to grab my cards, and our hands brushed. I didn't pull away, letting the moment linger. He looked at me, and for a second, I thought his gaze stayed on me longer than it needed to. "You cheating, Ronald?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. I shrugged and said, "Maybe I just want you to stick around a bit longer." By the end of the night, I felt like I'd made progress. Edward didn't shy away from my hints, and that gave me a boost. I knew I had to be patient, but I was already imagining us getting closer. When he went to bed, I stayed in the living room, replaying every look and word in my head. My game was on, and I was ready to play it till I won. By the time a week had passed since Edward moved in, I could tell my efforts were starting to pay off. Our conversations were getting longer, his smiles warmer, and I was playing my sneaky game carefully, every move designed to pull him closer. But I never expected one random night to turn everything Robin Hood style, making my heart pound like I'd just run a marathon. It was a Friday evening, and Clarence, as usual, had headed off to a party downtown in Memphis. Edward and I stayed back at the apartment, and I suggested cracking open a couple of beers to unwind after a week of lectures. He agreed, and soon we were lounging on the couch, sipping drinks and chatting about random stuff, from favorite comedies to the time he got stuck in an elevator for 2 hours. I noticed he was sitting closer than usual, his knee almost brushing mine. It was a signal, and I decided it was time to take a chance. "You know, Edward, you're not like the other guys I've met around here," I said, locking eyes with him and keeping my voice sincere. He raised an eyebrow and asked, "Is that a compliment, or are you up to something again?" His tone was playful, but there was a spark of something new in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe. I wasn't backing down. "A compliment, but maybe a hint too," I said with a grin, leaning in just a bit closer. The moment hung in the air, and I could feel my heart racing. I knew it was a risk, but something inside me said it was now or never. I slowly reached out and touched his shoulder, letting my fingers linger. He didn't pull away, just looked at me, his breathing getting a little heavier. That's when I went for it. I leaned in and softly pressed my lips to his. It was like a spark, warm, electric, and I froze, waiting for his reaction. To my shock, he didn't push me away. After a second, I felt his lips respond, hesitant at first, then firmer. His hand slid to the back of my neck, and we deepened the kiss, letting the moment take over. I could feel the warmth of his body, the faint scent of beer and his cologne, and it was all dizzying. My fingers traced along his neck, feeling his muscles tense, and I wanted to memorize every second of this. We pulled back to catch our breath, and he gave me a small smile. "Didn't peg you for the bold type, Ronald," he said quietly, and I laughed, trying to hide how much I was shaking inside. "You have no idea," I shot back, and we leaned into each other again, letting our hands explore but keeping things gentle. I felt his strength, but also his softness, and the combination was driving me wild. That night, we didn't go too far, but every look and touch was charged with possibility. When we finally headed to our rooms, I lay in the dark, replaying every moment, and knew my game had just leveled up big time. After that night when Edward and I crossed the line, I felt like I was on top of the world, but I knew I had to be more careful. My cunning had gotten me this far, but now I needed to keep his interest without raising flags with Clarence or anyone else in the dorm. Edward and I started finding ways to be together in secret, and each of those moments felt like a little adventure, packed with risk and emotion. One evening, a few days after our first kiss, I suggested to Edward that we take a walk around campus. Clarence was busy studying for an exam, so we had some time. "There's this spot behind the library where nobody hangs out," I said, trying to sound casual, even though I was buzzing with anticipation inside. He nodded, and we headed out, slipping through the dark pathways lit only by streetlights. Behind the library was an old garden, overgrown with bushes, with a wooden bench tucked away from prying eyes. We sat down, and I could feel the tension between us building right away. "You always find these hidden spots, Ronald?" he asked with a slight smirk, and I shot back, "Only when I've got something to keep under wraps." His laugh was soft but warm, and I knew he was as eager for this moment as I was. I scooted closer, and he didn't pull away. My hand rested on his knee, and I felt his muscles tense under my touch. We locked eyes, and there was something in his gaze that made my heart race, a mix of curiosity and want. I leaned in, and our lips met, soft at first but growing more certain. His hands slid down my back, pulling me closer, and I felt the warmth of his body, so familiar yet still thrilling. We let ourselves get lost in the moment, our touches careful but full of meaning. I ran my hand across his chest, noticing how his breathing quickened, and it was like a signal that he was just as caught up as I was. My fingers lingered on his shoulders, feeling their strength, and I couldn't help but smile when he gently squeezed my waist in return. It was more than just being close. Every move we made showed we trusted each other, even if we were keeping it all a secret. At one point we heard footsteps nearby, and we both froze, listening hard. It was just a security guard passing by, but the adrenaline made everything sharper. "We gotta be quieter," Edward whispered, his voice so low it gave me chills. We laughed, pressing closer together, and carried on, but with more caution, letting the silence of the garden cover our movements. When we got back to the dorm, I was both exhilarated and calm. Edward gave me a quick look before heading to his room, and I knew he was thinking about what happened too. My game was still in play, but now I started wondering if I was getting in too deep myself. By the time our secret meetups with Edward became a regular thing, I felt like I was walking a tightrope. My cunning had helped us carve out moments of closeness, but I knew it was only a matter of time before someone caught on. Clarence, our roommate, wasn't the nosy type, but his habit of showing up at the worst possible moments kept me on edge. Still, when Edward and I were together, every risk felt worth it. One evening, Clarence announced he was heading to his parents' place in Little Rock for the weekend. It was like a gift from the universe. I texted Edward right away, "Free house for 2 days. Wanna hang?" He shot back a quick, "I'm in," and my heart did a little leap. That night, after Clarence left, Edward and I settled in the living room with a bottle of wine I'd stashed for a special occasion. We sat on the couch, and I deliberately picked a spot close to him. The wine loosened us up, and soon we were cracking up over some dumb story about his high school pranks. I looked at him, his dark hair, slightly messy, and the way his eyes sparkled in the lamplight. "You're too good for Memphis, you know that?" I said, leaning in closer. He grinned and replied, "And you're too bold for your own good, Ronald." I didn't wait. My hand slid to his neck, and I pulled him into a kiss. This kiss was deeper than before, warm, insistent, with a slight tremor that ran through me every time his lips moved against mine. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me so close I could feel the heat of his body through his shirt. My fingers slipped under his shirt, tracing the firmness of his shoulders and the softness of his skin, and I couldn't hold back a smile when he let out a quiet breath at my touch. We let ourselves forget everything else, our movements growing bolder. I ran my hand down his back, feeling his muscles tense, and he responded by gently gripping my hips. It was like a dance. Every gesture, every sigh showed we both wanted to be right here. We pulled back only for a second to catch our breath, and I caught his gaze, full of trust and something else that made my heart race. But right in the middle of it, I heard the sound of a key in the lock. My stomach dropped and I pulled back, looking at Edward. "Clarence," he whispered, and I nodded, trying to pull myself together. The door swung open, and Clarence walked in, clearly not expecting to find us so close. His face fell and he muttered, "Damn, I thought you guys were just watching TV." I stood up fast, fixing my clothes, and said, "Hey, you were supposed to be at your parents'. What happened?" Clarence looked annoyed but not angry. "My mom got sick, had to come back," he said, glancing at Edward. "I'm not gonna pry into your business, but man, not in the living room." His tone was sharp, but I felt a wave of relief. He wasn't going to make a scene. I nodded and said, "Sorry, we just got carried away." Edward stayed quiet, but I could see him tense up. When Clarence went to his room, I turned to Edward and whispered, "That was close." He smiled, but I caught a flicker of worry in his eyes. My game was still on, but now I knew I had to be even sneakier to protect what we had. After that night when Clarence almost caught me and Edward, I got even more careful, but it only made me crave him more. My cunning had helped us steal moments of closeness, but now I started noticing my heart wasn't sticking to the plan. Edward was like a puzzle I wanted to solve, but the closer we got, the more I suspected he wasn't as committed to this as I was. That thought ate at me, but I kept playing my game, hoping I could hold on to him. One Saturday, when Clarence headed out to a football game, I decided to set up something special for Edward. I decorated the living room with candles I found in the storage closet and played his favorite rock music on low volume. "What's with all the romance, Ronald?" he asked as he walked in, and his smile was so warm it made my doubts melt away. "Just figured we deserve something nice," I replied, scooting closer. We sat on the couch, and I poured us some wine left over from last time. The conversation flowed easily, but I steered it toward more personal stuff. "Ever thought about being with someone in a not-so-typical way?" I asked, looking into his eyes. He shrugged and said, "Honestly, I don't think about that stuff much. I just go with the moment." His words stung, but I hid it with a smile, telling myself I'd change his mind eventually. I moved closer and we started kissing, slow, with that deep tenderness that made me forget everything else. His hands slid over my shoulders, pulling me in, and I responded, tracing my fingers across his chest, feeling his heartbeat under my palm. Our kisses grew bolder, and I could feel his warmth, his breath mingling with mine. My fingers lingered on his neck, and I felt him shiver slightly when I brushed the skin just below his ear. It was like a jolt of electricity, and I knew he felt it too. We kept going, letting our hands explore, but staying within what felt safe. I pressed against him, feeling the strength of his embrace, and for a moment, it was like we were in our own world, untouchable. But that moment shattered in the most unexpected way. My phone buzzed on the table and I tried to ignore it, but Edward pulled back and said, "Maybe check it? Could be important." I grabbed the phone reluctantly and saw a text from our mutual friend, Leroy. It read, "Saw Edward with some girl at a cafe on Beale Street. You know about this?" My stomach dropped, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked at Edward, still sitting next to me, and asked, keeping my voice steady, "Were you at a cafe on Beale Street today?" He hesitated, and that was all I needed to know. "Just coffee with a friend," he said, but his tone was too casual, and I felt my confidence crumble. I stood up, trying to hide how much it hurt. "Here I thought we were building something," I said, my voice cracking. Edward tried to explain, but I wasn't listening anymore. My game, my manipulations, it all felt pointless now. I turned and walked to my room, leaving him in the living room, surrounded by candle. After that night when I found out about Edward meeting a girl, my confidence in what we had started to wobble, but I wasn't ready to give up. My cunning had always kept things under control, but now I felt my grip slipping. Edward was more than just a part of my game, and that scared me. I decided to give him a chance to explain, hoping I could bring back the warmth I felt in our closest moments. The next day, I found him in the living room, sitting with a book but clearly not reading. His gaze was distant, and I knew he was thinking about what happened too. "We need to talk," I said softly, sitting across from him. He nodded, setting the book aside, and looked at me with such sincerity that my heart tightened. "Ronald, I didn't mean to hurt you," he started, his voice gentle, almost apologetic. I listened as he explained that the girl was just a friend from Nashville he sometimes hung out with. "It wasn't a date," he said, "but I get why you'd think that." I wanted to believe him, but there was still an ache in my chest. "Then what are we, Edward?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He went quiet, and that silence spoke louder than words. "I don't know," he said finally. "I like being with you, but I haven't thought about anything serious." His honesty was like a soft breeze, refreshing but chilling. I nodded, feeling my expectations crumble, but I didn't argue. Instead, I decided to spend one more evening with him to figure out if it was worth fighting for. We agreed to watch a movie, and I picked an old drama I knew he liked. We sat on the couch, and I deliberately left some space between us, not wanting to push. As the movie started, I noticed him shift closer. His hand gently rested on mine, and I felt the warmth of his fingers, soft and comforting. "Is this okay?" he asked quietly, and I nodded, letting him pull me closer. We sat pressed together, and I could feel his breathing light and steady as my fingers laced with his. It wasn't like our earlier moments. There was no spark, but there was a tenderness that felt almost like a goodbye. At one point he turned to me and our eyes met. I saw regret in his gaze, but also warmth. He leaned in and kissed me softly, not with the passion we'd had before, but with a quiet care, like he was trying to apologize. I kissed him back, feeling his lips move slowly, and my hands slid to his neck, lingering to hold onto the moment. It was our gentlest moment, but it was tinged with sadness. When the movie ended, we just sat there, holding hands. "I really do like being with you," he said, but I knew it wasn't enough. My game had gone too far, and I realized I'd built up an illusion of something more. I smiled and said, "I know, Edward. But I need more." We went to our rooms and my heart ached quietly, but deep down, a small spark of hope told me I'd find my way. After that night when I realized my connection with Edward wouldn't grow into something more, I felt like a piece of me had gone hollow. My cunning, which had always let me steer things my way, failed me this time, and I was left facing reality. But there was something cleansing in that pain, like I was finally seeing the real me. I decided it was time to let go of illusions and find a way to move forward, holding on to the warmth of the moments Edward and I shared. We kept living in the same apartment, and that wasn't easy. Edward was still his friendly self, but there was an invisible wall between us now. I stopped chasing his glances or trying to create chances for closeness. Instead, I threw myself into classes and hanging out with friends, trying to fill the emptiness left after our talk. Clarence, to his credit, never brought up what he'd seen, and I was grateful for his silence. One evening, I was in my room, scrolling through old photos on my phone, and came across a picture of me and Edward laughing over some joke from his first month here. I smiled, but I didn't feel the usual pang of longing. Instead, I thought about how much I'd learned about myself through all this. I realized I wanted real closeness. Not games, not manipulations, but something genuine where both people are on the same page. I decided to talk to Edward one last time to close this chapter. I found him in the kitchen, making coffee. "Got a sec?" I asked, and he nodded, setting his mug aside. I spoke calmly, trying to be honest. "You taught me a lot, Edward," I said. "I don't regret what happened, but I need to move on." He looked at me with a touch of sadness and said, "I don't regret it either, Ronald. You're great, and I hope you find someone who's right for you." His words were simple, but they carried a kindness that made me feel lighter. We hugged, brief but warm, and I felt the tension between us finally dissolve. It wasn't a forever goodbye, more like an acknowledgement that we were both ready for new paths. Back in my room, I sat on my bed, staring out the window at the twinkling lights of Memphis. I thought about how life rarely gives perfect endings, but there's beauty in that messiness. Now, I want to turn to you, friends. How do you handle heartbreak? Have you ever had a moment where you knew you had to let someone go to keep moving forward? And how do you find the strength to look for something new after the hurt? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd genuinely love to hear your stories. I don't know what's waiting for me out there, but I believe there's someone who'll want the same things I do. That feeling, a mix of hope and calm, became my new beginning.